Dr. Oliver A. Rosales is a professor of history and ethnic studies at Bakersfield College, where he previously served as faculty coordinator of the Social Justice Institute. His teaching and research focus on Chicano-Chicana, California, United States, and world history. Dr. Rosales has held appointments as a visiting faculty member at Bard College and as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies. He is the author of Civil Rights in Bakersfield, Segregation and Multiracial Activism in the Central Valley, published by University of Texas Press in 2024, which received the following awards: Outstanding Book and Media Award from the Association of Ethnic Studies, the 2025 Ambassador Julian Nava Best Ethnic Studies Book Award, and an honorable mention for the Norris Hundley Book Award from the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. A former board chair for California Humanities from 2022 to 2024, he is a recipient of the Whiting Foundation's Public Engagement Fellowship and multiple grants from National Endowment for the Humanities. Please give a warm virtual welcome to our moderator, Dr. Rosales.
Oh, thank you, Deb, so much. And thank you for the California State Library for inviting me to moderate this panel. I can't express how excited I am to engage in this conversation this afternoon for a myriad of reasons, not only given the expertise of the speakers, but really just the moment I think that we're in terms of California history, multi-ethnic history, and the history of rural California. And I think that each of these speakers tonight is going to push those conversation. The research pushes those that history in new directions that I think is just so urgently needed right now. So I'm so excited to again engage in some dialogue with these folks tonight and to hear their presentations. And of course, as the library was saying, for those audience members who have questions along the way, feel free to drop those obviously in the chat, in the Q&A function, and we'll try to field those as we move along tonight. But again, I just want to underscore the importance of tonight's event in helping us rethink rural California, helping us think in critical ways, diverse ways about the history of farm labor, migration, and activism in California, and particularly the other California, what the writer Gerald Haslam once called Central California. So again, I'm so honored to be here and excited to introduce the speakers. So let me begin with Dr. Nicole Ranganath. She is an associate director and associate professor in Middle East and South Asian Studies at the University of California at Davis. She has authored articles, book chapters, and a book specializing on the history of gender, faith, and music in the South Asian diaspora. She participates in international collaboration centering on digital and oceanic humanities, with fieldwork in California, India, Pakistan, and Fiji. Her recent book, Women and the Sikh Diaspora in California, Singing the Seven Seas, published by Routledge Press in 2024, traces the transoceanic history of the first generation of South Asian women in California through their speech and songs throughout the 20th century. Her current book project focuses on the relationship between gender, music, and historical trauma in Punjab and its global diaspora. Her other creative work includes a 2018 PBS documentary, Jati Kasuri, I apologize if I am messing the pronunciation, that documents the history of women in California's Punjabi community. She is also the founding curator of the UC Davis Punjabi and Sikh Digital Archive that was launched in 2016. With a generous grant from the UC system, she helped establish the UC Punjabi Without Walls online curriculum, as well as the Punjabi program at UC Davis, which is now among the largest in North America. Her research is funded by the Mellon Foundation, the American Association of University Women, California Humanities, and the University of California. And before I turn it over to her, I just want to say, when I was serving on the board for California Humanities, you promoted so many wonderful discussions among the screening panels and the board when your projects came through. So it's such a pleasure to be on this end. And as I thanked you before we got started tonight, I was so grateful to host you for our Delano students, because again, the research that you're doing is just pushing the conversation in a direction. So without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for the warm invitation, and I want to thank the organizers for this important conversation, which I think couldn't be more timely and urgent. And I think in particular, excited to be on this panel with my colleagues because they've done path-breaking research. And I don't think it's the California Central Valley gets the credit it deserves, both for its diversity, but also for its contributions to both like national and world history. So my talk very much connects California's history to global history. So I'm going to talk today about the history of California's Punjabi farmers, going back, which some of you may be surprised to learn, goes back 130 years. So, and as was mentioned, I recently published a book that was about the history of the first women who joined the South Asian diaspora from Punjab here in California. And the idea today is to kind of to gesture towards a more inclusive history of California's Punjabi farmers. And so I'll be talking about really the diverse range of people, but particularly farm workers and a role they played in our local history, but also in the history of the Indian subcontinent. So for those of us who are not familiar with Punjab, this is a part of South Asia from in the northern region, and you can see a map on the upper middle of the screen, which shows the historical undivided Punjab. And today, the Punjab has been separated through the partition in 1947 and is significantly smaller. So when the British left the subcontinent in 1947, the majority of the landmass in the Punjab region went to the newly formed country of Pakistan. And then the remaining land was in the eastern side of India's Punjab, which was further subdivided. So this area you see here delineated as Punjab is actually just a small percentage of the historical region where you have Punjabi speakers. And to give you an idea of the importance of this region of South Asia and California, I'll just give you, in the world, I'll give you a few statistics, which are Punjabis have settled really all over the world, and particularly in the modern period since the late 19th century. And they first, left in the modern era as part of the British Army, and they served in East Asia, in Singapore and Shanghai and Hong Kong. And from there, they heard of greater opportunities in North America. So beginning in the 1890s, they started coming via ship to Vancouver, and then also along the west coast of North America, all the way down to San Francisco. And they, for a variety of complex reasons, there was a large population in Canada, but then there was exclusionary legislation targeting South Asians from settling in Canada. And after that happened, a number of Punjabis crossed the border into the United States. They worked in the lumber industry in Washington and in Oregon. They also worked in constructing the railroad, which many people aren't aware, in California, which ended up like near Yuba City and Marysville. So some of these Punjabi workers ended up in the Yuba City area. And when they came here, it just reminded them so much of Punjab, which literally means the land of five rivers in Persian and in Punjabi. And when they saw the Sacramento Valley, they called it the other land of five rivers because the topography was so similar. You had the mountains and then the rich alluvial soil created by five major rivers that flow into the Sacramento region, which is so similar to the Punjab region in South Asia. And what kind of life did they live once they came here? So, like as I said, about half of the early Punjabi immigrants had served in the British Army, and they, in the early decades, lived as migrant workers. Very few women came along with the men. And so the idea was that the men would, they'd kind of travel the world, including to North America. And the idea was that they would save up enough capital and then return to Punjab and buy land there. But about half of them did end up going back, but half ended up staying in the United States. And they lived in very difficult conditions. And here is an early farm camp in an area between Yuba City and Live Oak. And it was documented in a master's thesis at Berkeley in 1950. And here was a place where in the organization of labor in the early 20th century, each of the camps was racially segregated. So you had camp for Japanese immigrants, for Chinese immigrants, for Punjabi immigrants, and so forth. And this was, a camp filled with men who lived communally, and one of them would cook for the whole community. And they also they're pictured here in Sacramento in 1910. And although they were kind of warmly welcomed at the very beginning, soon after their arrival, there was a racial backlash, particularly against Punjabis who wore turbans. And this was kind of for two reasons. First of all, the history of South Asian immigrants to North America is intimately tied to other racial communities or racialized communities. And so there had been a long history going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of targeting Asian immigrants. And first it was the Chinese, then Japanese immigrants were targeted. Now, after the Japanese immigrants came, the South Asian immigrants came. And even though at its height, there was only about 10,000 South Asian immigrants in Canada and the US, like in the first decade of the 20th century, there was this kind of hysterical reaction. And so the racially exclusive kind of working class white unions and the Asiatic Exclusion League called this a so-called tide of turbans, or sounded the alarm that the presence of these immigrants from a completely different culture, speaking a different language and being dressed differently, were just too different to assimilate into American society. And there were also, especially when there was an economic recession, there were these race riots up and down the west coast of North America, from Vancouver. The largest one was in Bellingham, Washington in 1907. And then all the way down to California, there were a number of these race riots. So how did the Punjabi immigrants then fight back against this kind of discrimination? And one of the things that happened is that with the growing exclusionary legislation that was targeting South Asian immigrants who were primarily from Punjab and primarily of the Sikh faith, that when they were excluded from owning land, as had happened with other Asian immigrants. And then also when there was the landmark 1923 Supreme Court decision that said that South Asians were not white. The Punjabi immigrants, they responded in a variety of ways. One was, as like I mentioned, very few Punjabi women were able to immigrate to the US. And there were laws against Asian immigrants and white Americans from being able to intermarry at this time. And so the Punjabi and Mexican communities worked together in the fields. And what emerged was a Punjabi Mexican American community between 1916 and the 1940s, in which you saw a pretty hybrid community, and you had older Punjabi men who married younger Mexican women who had fled from the Mexican Revolution. Over the decades, this community ended up kind of integrating into the mainstream society. But you only saw the exclusionary legislation that barred Asian immigrants, and including South Asian immigrants, overturned. That only happened after World War II. So from the 1910s until 1946, the Punjabi immigrants had very little civil rights in this country. Very few were able to own land. They couldn't marry whom they pleased, and they were denied citizenship and the right to own land. And so what happened, one of the most fascinating aspects of this history is that you had Punjabi immigrants form the first movement to overthrow British rule in India. And this anti-colonial movement was headquartered here in California. And here's some of the individuals who played the most important role in what was called the Ghadar Party. And Ghadar is a word in Urdu and in Punjabi that means revolt or revolution. And so the Punjabi immigrants who settled here in the early 20th century, they became involved in a number of efforts to fight for their rights and for social justice. The primary example is the Ghadar Party, like I said, and the aim of this party was to overthrow British rule in India. So it was established in Oregon in 1913, and the founding president was Sohan Singh Bhakna. And the organizations of South Asian immigrants also played a very important role, including the first Gurdwara, or Sikh temple, that was established in the United States when it was created in 1912 in Stockton, California. And the Sikh Gurdwara played a crucial role in this movement in providing financial support, social support, and also it provided fellowships, scholarships for students throughout India to come and study, particularly at UC Berkeley. So with the Ghadar movement, the intellectuals and the students were the most famous members of the movement, but really the backbone of the movement were the Punjabi Sikh farm workers of the Central Valley, and they provided the most financial support. And also when there was a call in 1914 and 15 to go back to India and overthrow the British there, 8,000 South Asians around the world, including thousands from North America went back after basically investing much of their family savings to create a better life in North America. They basically turned back around almost immediately and did their duty and went back to India to secure independence. Probably the most famous person in this revolutionary movement was named Kartar Singh Saraba, and he came to the United States at a very young age, and he came to study at UC Berkeley. But shortly after he arrived, he was radicalized, and he, like so many of the Punjabi immigrants who participated in this revolutionary movement, he felt that South Asians would always be treated as second-class citizens abroad as long as India was a slave country to the British, and that the only way to regain their honor and dignity in the world was by liberating their homeland, India. Here's a picture also. Kartar Singh Saraba ended up just dedicating his life to the Ghadar movement. And in 1913, he helped establish the Ghadar newspaper, and which was printed in San Francisco. And here's a picture of the Ghadar printing press that now sits in the Stockton Gurdwara. So many of these early issues are now housed in Berkeley's Bancroft Library. And one thing I want to mention that I'm sure other panelists may discuss as well is the treatment that Asian immigrants experienced upon entering the United States. So unlike, Ellis Island on the East Coast, and this idea of the United States opening immigrants from Europe with open arms, on the West Coast, the Asian immigrants who came through what was called Angel Island, that existed between 1910 and 1940, had a very different experience. And so they were often quarantined for long durations so that they didn't bring disease to this country, and so that they didn't become a public charge here. The interrogation by immigration officers was one of the main drivers that for causing South Asian immigrants to join the Ghadar Party, because it was so humiliating, the line of questioning. And here's the interview with Kartar Singh Saraba at Angel Island in 1912. So in terms of the philosophy of the Ghadar movement, in 1913, this was the call to action, and it gives you an idea of the kind of revolutionary philosophy that was espoused in these newspapers. And here it says, "Arise, brave ones, quickly. We want all brave and self-sacrificing warriors who can raise revolt. Salary, death. Reward, martyrdom. Pension, freedom. Field of battle, India." So when World War I began, the members of the Ghadar Party felt that this was their opportunity to overthrow British rule in India because they were distracted by the war. One other thing I want to mention about this revolutionary movement is not only was the backbone provided by Punjabi farm workers, particularly in California's Central Valley, but there are some members of the Ghadar Party that are very rarely mentioned. First of all, is a figure named Babu Manguram from India. And this is very important because he was one of the first so-called untouchables or Dalits who were considered, outcasts in India's caste system, who migrated to the United States in the early 20th century, and his role has not been properly acknowledged. And so he was one of the people who made large contributions to the Ghadar movement and even went back to India to be a part of it. Also significant is that he was radicalized by his experience in the United States, and upon returning to India, he played a tremendous role in the religious and social life of Dalits or untouchables in Punjab. So it's important to acknowledge his role. And also on the right here is Gulab Kaur, and she was one of the few female leaders of the revolutionary movement. She lived in the Philippines, and she also dedicated her life to giving speeches and advocating for Ghadar. She was imprisoned and then died at an early age. But most famously, Kartar Singh Sarabha and a few dozen other individuals were hanged when they returned to India to foment an uprising against the British, and he was hanged at the age of 19. So I just have 2 more minutes, which is to say, a lot of my research, and I'm most interested in ordinary people who live extraordinary lives. And I'll wrap up with a few things, which is to say, as I mentioned before, it was very difficult for Punjabi families to get established in the United States. Here is a rare photograph of one of the few families who came from Punjab. And it's such an extraordinary family. The man who's sitting on the right with a child on his lap, his name is Bakshish Singh Dillon. And he was one of the first South Asians to join the industrial workers of the world. He was very important in the Ghadar movement. And his daughter, who's sitting on his lap, and her sister were the two of the first recorded Punjabi Sikh women to be born in the United States. They're born in California in 1914 and 15, and their mother, who's in the middle, Ratan Kaur, is the first recorded Punjabi woman who migrated to the U.S. in 1910. And I guess I am really running out of time, but I think a good person to end this on is the Ghadar movement involved discussions and collaborations across difference within the South Asian diaspora community, but also with revolutionaries of many different backgrounds from Ireland, from Turkey, from Germany, and many other places. Also, those who participated in this revolutionary movement, even after it was quashed by the British in 1915, went on to be involved in many other causes. So Kartar Kaur Dillon, she became a writer. She, like I said, was born in 1915 in California, and she went on to be involved with the Black Panthers, with unionizing efforts, and with Ku Klux Klan rallies in San Francisco. So even though the movement was short-lived, the effect that it had in transforming people's lives and also inspiring them to create common cause with workers from different backgrounds continued all the way up until the present. So I've run out of time, and I want to say thank you so much.
No, thank you, Nicole, so much for that presentation. And again, for the audience members, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat at any time. I actually do want to ask a question, Dr. Ranganath, and I'm hoping, Punjabi Sikhs are in the news right now, right, with respect to the conflicts over the trucking industry and whatnot. I'm curious for the audience if you can kind of connect the evolution of the historic communities that you're studying with respect to the evolution of their position in the labor market, right? I mean, is there a kind of mobility out of farm labor, like the rise of small businesses. Can you just talk a little bit about the evolution of the communities that you study into more present times?
Um, that's a big question, but I would say that the fact that the Punjabi community had such did eventually establish very strong family networks in the United States, especially after immigration was reinstated in 1946 and especially after 1965. And that formed a very solid base then for sponsoring relatives from India. And that is why, like, Punjabi is the third most commonly spoken language in the Central Valley. And you have also the backgrounds of the South Asian immigrants who are related to the earliest farm workers are quite different than, say, the highly educated, affluent, you know, immigrants who came that were sponsored by the 1965 Immigration Act based on their education and wealth and so forth. But also, I think it gets to something really fundamental about Punjabi Sikh culture too. That why would Punjabis continue to go into farm work, which there's the agriculture is still dominant, you know, in Punjab. That's one reason. But also there's this idea of like the dignity of farm work and that you are your own boss. You have your own sovereignty and you're not working for someone else. There's somewhat of that idea as well in trucking, right? So 40% of truckers in California are Punjabi Sikhs, 20% in the country. And partly because of their, you know, qualifications, they went into trucking and they already had connections and they used those networks to get jobs. But also they could like maintain their own cultural traditions and faiths while working in trucking, right? So it's complicated, but it's definitely connected to this older migration that goes back to the early 20th century. And it also has to do with, I think, cultural values that are associated with labor.
No, thank you. That definitely helps me think about the history behind the current moment. For the audience members, again, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end, but we're going to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Adrian Cruz. He is a sociologist, currently teaching classes on race, ethnicity, and immigration at Temple University's Japan campus in Tokyo. Prior to his work in Japan, he was a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Tufts University. He completed his PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where he wrote a dissertation titled Racialized Fields, Asians, Mexicans, and the Farm Labor Struggle in California. He has also authored articles on farm labor mobilization in California, which are published in Cultural Dynamics, Race and Class, and Social Movement Studies. His current research with Matt Bloomberg is an interview-based research project on the booming Mexican food movement in the Tokyo metropolis. So welcome, Adrian.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Good morning to everybody. I assume everyone's in. Can you hear me? Am I coming through? Okay.
Yeah, you're good, Adrian.
Okay. I'm really nervous about sharing my screen. I don't PowerPoint, and now I know after watching my co-panelist, I really need to up my PowerPoint game. So you're going to learn that today. I'm in Tokyo. Good morning to everybody in North America. I'm here to tell you that Friday is looking okay so far, since we're already getting through it. So it's Thursday for you, but Friday looks like it's going to be fine. Let me go ahead and yes, I'm Adrian Cruz. I teach sociology here at Temple University's campus in Tokyo. We're a school that's growing, almost 4,000 students, and it's quite an interesting experience to teach a US-based curriculum in Japan. So let me share my screen. Let's see here. All right. Got that. All right. Is that coming through? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry about this. I'm not even. Yeah. Like I said, I don't PowerPoint. It's been a long time. I don't know if anybody here, I'm going to say a few names. I don't know if you recognize these names or not. Has anybody here ever heard of Peter Velasco? Send a thumbs up. Philip Vera Cruz. Larry Itliong. Does anybody know that name in California history? Mr. Itliong, he wrote the line there that's the title of the talk. May I let you know that it was our people who started the strike? And I'll just start out strong by saying Filipinos started the farm labor strike that culminated in groundbreaking labor contracts, path-breaking labor contracts, CBAs, in 1970. They started the strike. But they did more than that. They actually contributed and built a labor organizing tradition in California, and that tradition has not been acknowledged fully. It has not been fully documented or written about. As for myself, people often think that I'm Filipino. Now that line was written in 1967 by Mr. Itliong, by Larry. I'm going to call him Larry. You get into the archives and you start to feel like you know these people. So Larry wrote that line in 1967 to a local Filipino American leader to tell him, listen, we're the ones who got this thing going, which of course was true. But the history of Filipino organizing is there was so much more that happened before the 1960s in California. As for myself, and this may seem a little self-indulgent, I'm not Filipino. I'm a Chicano. I'm a Mexican American kid, born and raised in South Texas. If anybody knows the lower Rio Grande Valley, Brownsville, Texas. I grew up 30 miles north of there in a small farming town. My parents were farm workers as kids. My father was one of 10. My mom was one of 6. And they told me these stories. I mean, the idea of farm work was, I never had to go to the fields myself, but my parents always reminded my brother and I, if we started ever whined or complained, they would always tell us, listen, you never had to work in the fields. You escaped that life. You got to go to school. You have your own room, your own bedroom. We didn't have those things. So it was always in my mind. But it always seemed odd to me. My father was segregated into Americanization schools. And later on, when I was, 18, 19 years old, when I started, I guess, to intellectualize, become an intellectual and started to read, I started to read books that really blew my mind. And the first book that blew my mind when I was 19 years old was Borderlands, La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa. Then I read Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas by David Montejano. And these books really built my identity. It built this sort of sense of Chicanismo, of Mexican Americanness inside of me, and it felt good. It gave me this frame and this rootedness that I really wanted and desired. And it taught me a lot about my family's history. I essentially learned that much of the time, my grandparents and my parents lived in debt peonage. They were basically ripped off by the people who employed them. They were always in debt to them. They were always in the red. And I just, and so for many years, I was like, I'm a proud Mexican American. I'm a proud Chicano. As I started to get into research, I thought, I'm going to talk about Mexican Americans. That's what I'm going to study. Mexican American community. But in 1999, I was a PhD student at the University of Illinois, and I read a book called Racial Fault Lines: The Historical Origins of White Supremacy in California by Tomás Almaguer. And Professor Almaguer in that book, he's Chicano, he's Mexican American, he's a Mexican American sociologist, but he analyzes the structure of late 19th century California as having deeply racialized politics and even racist politics. My co-panelists noted this, right? They were talking about, how, the Central Valley is part of national history and global history, right? And that needs to be discussed and analyzed. So in Almaguer's work, he talks not just about Mexicans, but he talks about, a racial hierarchy that exists. There are whites, there are Japanese, there are indigenous people, there are blacks, African Americans, and there are Latinos, Mexicans as well. So it's not just one group. So, I had to, as I went off to the archives, the Ruther Library in Detroit, I knew that I wanted to talk about Mexicans or investigate Mexicans and Filipinos. But I admit that in my mind, I was really seeing Filipinos as more minor characters. But boy, did I learn. The archives will teach you something, right? As I got into the archives, I thought to myself, I'm studying this social movement, right? This farm worker movement. But I kept going further back in time. I wanted to confine myself to the 1950s and 1960s, but I found that just couldn't be the case. I went back to the 1930s and I saw that there were strike waves there from 1933 to 1939. I went back into the 20s. I started looking at Filipinos in Hawaii, and I realized this is not just a social movement. When we talk about social movements, I think we should conceptualize and understand those as very organizationally bound, geographically bound, temporally bound, and that's okay. It's okay to study something like the UFW or the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee or the National Farm Workers of America. But the historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall taught me that, in fact, we should understand these moments, right, these organizations as part of a broader historical trend that we can refer to, or that I refer to as struggle. So, for example, right now in California, there really is no, as far as I can discern or tell, there's really no there's really no movement for farm workers that I can see. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think there is one, but there is a struggle. There is struggle. As long as people are out there working in the fields, as long as we know that there are undocumented folks that are being exploited, there is struggle. If people are struggling, then there's a struggle. There may not be a social movement going on, or people speaking up for them, organizations speaking up for them, but there is struggle. So we should understand the farm workers engaging in agitation. Sometimes they're in states of agitation, sometimes they're not. Right? When we understand struggle, when we frame the processes that we're studying as struggle, we can see the peaks and the valleys, the periods of abeyance and dormancy, when sometimes we don't, and I'm using the work of the sociologist Verda Taylor. We understand that we cannot just, by studying one social movement, that's good, but we're studying something that is a component of a broader struggle. And Filipinos were central to that struggle. The historian Zaragoza Vargas teaches us that, in fact, when folks of color get out on the picket line, when they're fighting for their labor rights, when they're not just trying to secure more money, they are, in fact, trying to secure more civil rights. So, it's not just about earning more money. Attaining labor rights actually strengthens other parts of people's lives, of their personhood and their citizenship and their belongingness. It's not just about, again, making more money or acquiring more benefits. Really quickly, why are farm workers, or why are Asian Americans, why is there a near silence on Asian Americans in farm labor scholarship? My hypothesis is that perhaps in the 1960s and 1970s, often Asian American success, right, high levels of Asian American success, depending on how we define success, were such that maybe they were seen as a group that, they didn't suffer, or they can hold up on their own. Maybe that sort of blinded scholarship in some way or in some manner. I don't know. But what we do know is that there is indeed this near silence on Asian Americans in farm labor scholarship, certainly on Filipinos and their role in collective action. So I'm not going to read through all this. This is part of struggle, right? Everything that happened in the farm labor struggle did not just happen in California. In fact, Filipinos built a trans-Pacific labor organizing tradition, but not just tradition. Right? Resistance. We have to understand the positionality of groups. And Filipinos and my co-panelists, I think one theme that we have here running through the panel is empire, right? Imperialism, right? The British Empire and the American Empire. So all groups of people, migrants, right? We're talking about Punjabi folks who came from a long way, right? Filipinos who came from a long way. The sociologist Zinu Magbubani has a book titled "Bringing the Empire Home," right? Bringing the empire home, when colonizers, imperialists, when they take over and possess these lands, annex them. Of course, there's people in those places. At some point, many of those people end up coming back to the metropole, right? They come back to the center of empire. So for Filipinos, this is important, right? They don't have the same positionality as Mexicans, right, in California. They entered the U.S., if you will, as colonial subjects. They were not citizens. They were seen as colonial subjects, and therefore their entrance into the United States is so much more than, they entered just to work, right? Or they just showed up and they started working jobs. They were migrants who just were laboring. In fact, they were not just entering into the United States. They were not just entering into the heart of the American empire. They were confronting it. They were resisting it. And we saw that in my co-panelist's presentation, right? Resistance. And engaging in labor unionism and agitation is resistance, not just for workers' rights, as noted a couple of slides ago. It's also about securing rights in other parts of their life, of their lives, of their collective lives. And so you see on that list there, from Hawaii to Alaska to Washington State, California in the 1930s, Hawaii in the 1940s, various industries, salmon cannery, right? Salmon cannery unionism, sugar and pineapple in Hawaii, we see a deep Filipino involvement. A good case study of this that we can look at that I've done some work on many years ago, we can look at how Filipinos led the way. That will help us understand how Filipinos led the way is the 1961 Santa Cruz Brussels sprout strike. In fact, the Mexican American activist and organizer Ernesto Galarza commented on this, or he assessed this strike in 1961 as essential, quote, to the survival of the whole farm labor movement. Indeed, Filipinos were the vanguard. They were the leaders. And the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, was a Filipino-dominated labor union. There were Latinos, there were Mexicans and Mexican Americans in it. But 210 Filipino workers walked off the job in 1961. They were getting $1 an hour. They wanted $1.25. They were offered $1.10, so they walked off the job. And again, like as pointed out here, I wish I had taken photographs of documents. I'm learning from my co-panelists. That would have been probably nice. Again, this strike was essential to allowing the farm labor mobilization to sustain itself. Well, Larry Itliong, of course, the indefatigable Filipino labor organizer. There's a nice photograph of him. I wanted to put a photograph up of him with a stogie. He was a cigar smoker and seemed like such a cool character. He got up in front of the workers and essentially called out to them. Right, and you can read that quote for yourself. You can read that quote on your own. But what I want to point out here is the acknowledgement by Itliong that we have varying interests as compared to our Mexican brethren. We are not in the same position, and that has to be understood. We cannot get bogged down or blocked in or locked in by binaries. And that's what Professor Almaguer taught me when I read Racial Fault Lines, is that every group has a different position and is dealing with something different. We talk about this in sociology, that folks of color encounter different kinds of racism, right? There are racisms, not one racism. So anti-Filipino racism is not necessarily the same as anti-Mexican racism, right? Anti-Black racism is not the same as anti-Semitism. They are all racisms, but they are different, and we must understand how they are different in how they target and treat different groups. In essence, the Filipinos and Mexicans move towards what I would call the racial integration of a labor movement, right? The sociologist Moon-Ki Jung refers to it as interracialism. When folks, I talked about myself a few minutes ago, about my own consciousness. As we build our own sense of self, it can be good. I think that even tribalism can have its place, right? There's nothing, I think, necessarily wrong with that. But there should be, when groups come together, there should be an ideological transformation in which we certainly have a sense of who we are as people, our own identity. I can be Chicano, I can be Mexican American, but I must also have a consciousness of others, what they're experiencing, what they're going through. I say this to my students all the time. You may not be African American, you may not be Black, and you don't know what that experience is like in the United States, but you can build and maintain a Black consciousness. You can read the autobiography of Malcolm X. You can read Black Reconstruction in America. You can watch the film 12 Years a Slave. There are things you can do in order to understand what your fellow citizens, your fellow residents in the United States have gone through, or their ancestors have experienced. Really quickly, this was not just about two groups disliking each other or competing for jobs. Filipinos and Mexicans were certainly segregated into separate crews, but I'm not going to go through this data, but just to demonstrate to you, there were actual material inequalities between Filipinos and Mexicans. In essence, Filipino farm workers were poorer than Mexican farm workers. Their incomes were not as high. This is some census tract data that I utilized in a study many years ago. Excuse me, many years ago, sorry. I've been coughing, been repressing it, sorry. These charts here show you the income inequalities between Filipinos and Mexicans. So again, they were not in the same position, right? They did not necessarily have identical interests. And in fact, what we do know, or what I've surmised or I've concluded from some of the archival data, is that Itliong, at least Larry Itliong himself, when the union did form, when the UFW finally formed and signed contracts, the 3-year contract in 1970, it was regarded, and those are my words, it was regarded as a stopgap measure. They envisioned a future in which they would have, quote unquote, their own organization or something that served their own interests. That's not surprising because by 1970, we easily have half a century of Filipino labor organizing in the Trans-Pacific region. It's not surprising that in 1970 they would see themselves as something unique and distinct, again, with a distinct set of interests. The last thing I'm going to say is just for a minute here, and I think I'm under time. I think I'm good. Someone can tell me to be quiet if they need to. I think, and I'm just going to take a minute or a minute and a half here. I know that my perception is that sometimes some historians are apprehensive about oral histories, and the archives are central, and we need the documents, and we need the primary source materials, and they're precious, and archivists are they're heroes of mine, they're rock stars to me, and they're central, and we need them. But I think that what we also know, what we were reminded of last week, is that we do need to talk and interview people while they are still alive, so that we can learn everything. We must know as much as possible, and I think oral history interviews are essential. As long as people are alive, we can talk to them. And once they're gone, once they're dead, we can't get that information. We know that indeed everything that we're digging into in the documents, it's not telling us all the history. And if we don't know all that history, we need to know as much as possible, right? How much people are hurting, what kind of injustices people are experiencing, no matter who they are. All groups deserve justice. They really do. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Adrian, so much for that presentation. There are some questions in the chat that we'll get to. And again, if members of the audience want to throw questions in there, feel free to do that. But I'm going to take a lead off, Adrian, and kind of direct a question to you about your presentation that got me thinking. So I really appreciated how you highlighted the contributions of Larry Leong. And one of the things that was powerful for me in recent months was getting to spend some time with his son Johnny at Leong in Delano at his father's grave, where Larry's buried. And we were with a group of folks who were working with the Filipino American Historical Society. And one of the points that Johnny was stressing, and that I hadn't really thought of either. I mean, I knew it, but it didn't cross my mind, was, Larry Leong was almost 20 years senior to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And to your presentation, there's a deeper, longer history of Filipino activism, militant activism in the field. So I want to pose the question to you. Can you comment a little bit about why? Like, what is the source of Filipino militancy pre-1965? And then with Larry, I mean, I think it's safe to say, and maybe it was the late Don Mabalan who said this, that Larry Leong is arguably the most important labor civil rights figure in American history, arguably. So I'm kind of curious how you teach Larry Leong in a non-US context, and if you can kind of comment on how Larry's legacy is or isn't acknowledged outside of the US.
I'll do the best I can in answering those questions. They're fascinating. A few things. Number one, the militancy, the root of the militancy. I'm not sure, but one thing we do know, and it's very understudied, is that after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. took, if you will, took possession, annexed, colonized the Philippines. What a very understudied war is the Philippine-American War. There was a Filipino war for independence. There was resistance right from the start in the Philippines against U.S. imperialism. So I think that perhaps there was already a tradition of pushing back, right? And I think perhaps that is threaded throughout the 1900s, and Filipinos just carried that with them. I think that might be part of it. I will also say, very important, and I think this is true, although I don't have a precise quote from the archives, it's a sense. Sometimes you get a sense from the archives. You don't get the quotes you want. But I will say this, Cesar Chavez was not a labor organizer. He was a community organizer. He started in San Jose, California. And so my sense is that Pete Velasco, Philip Vera Cruz, and Larry Itliong regarded Chavez as someone who, again, came from another. It's perfectly fine to be a community organizer, but that's not labor organizing. That's not labor militancy. That's not talking to owners. That's not talking about, jobs and, shift work and, getting work in the packing house or the shed house. That's in many ways, a whole different ball game. As for how I teach about Filipino militancy, labor unionism, what I tell my students in Japan, and this is true, I grew up I grew up 10 miles from a place called Rio Farms in South Texas that produces grapefruit. You can go down to my local grocery store in Tokyo and buy a grapefruit. And some of that grapefruit's from Australia, and some of it is from Rio Farms in South Texas. So I tell my students, or if you go off and you have a pork cutlet, there's a pork cutlet dish in Japanese called tonkatsu. I don't know if people know what that is. But many of those pork cutlets, they were processed in the United States. Whether it be that grapefruit or whether it be that pork cutlet, a lot of the workers that are doing that work are undocumented folks from Mexico and Central America. And I tell my students, you are absolutely connected to these people. Just because you don't see it, just because you don't know it, when you're buying that grapefruit, when you're having that tonkatsu, you are actually linked because we're talking about global history. You are linked to these people who are being exploited in the United States and being mistreated, and right now are struggling like they always have, but don't really have a voice speaking for them. So I utilize people like Itliong, right, Larry, in order to sort of teach this to them that they're resisting, and you need to also resist, right? Help them. You need to help them resist. So that's my answer to your question.
No, I appreciate that, and maybe I can try to pull Dr. Ranganath or Nicole into this conversation. So previously, I'm not sure if we can open this up in the chat, but Dr. Ranganath dropped a wonderful link to a film right from the early '80s. Is this right, Nicole? On Punjabi organizing in Canada. I'm wondering if Nicole, because I haven't had a chance to see it, but I was kind of looking at it while y'all were presenting. Can you share a little bit about that film and maybe like what lessons can we learn or should we learn in teaching the history of farm labor organizing in the '80s, maybe with respect to that film?
I think, thank you so much. I was referring to a film made by this like a very famous, probably the most famous Indian documentary filmmaker. His name is Anand Patwardhan. And he made this beautiful film in 1981 called Utanda Wela, or A Timed Rise. And it's about a successful effort among recent Punjabi immigrants in British Columbia who were berry pickers. And also it was kind of somewhat inspired by Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement in California. And so the interesting thing watching it is reflecting about why is it, as Dr. Cruz said, like what we have a struggle everywhere. And there's have been scientists here at UC Davis who identify that the people who harvest and grow are the migrant workers who harvest our food in the Central Valley, oftentimes during the winter months, don't have enough to eat. They did a big study about this, which was recent. And so the struggle is there, and in fact has gotten worse in many ways, and yet there doesn't seem to be this coalescing of a major kind of movement to fight wages. And what you saw in the film, Our Time to Rise, was all of these confluence of factors that came together at just the right moment then that did led to a successful unionizing effort. And among individuals where it was very difficult to unionize, where they were on visas, they had come to Canada recently, they didn't speak English, they were afraid already of police officers, other the state, and basic, institutions of the state. And so that was it. Then I had so many students from UC Davis. We just hosted the filmmaker on campus. We screened that film, and students were so inspired by that because they hadn't seen a similar kind of movement more locally, even though the conditions call out for a movement. So I don't know if does that fully answer your question?
No, it really helps to contextualize, and really it shows how much we don't know or that we need to learn more about this history. And it really leads into a question that's in the chat from Patricia Heffron, and I'll read the question as is, and then I also kind of want to rephrase it a little bit to get us thinking about curriculum. The question was, why do you think the history books don't really talk about the Filipino involvement in the United Farmworkers? So that's one question in the air, but I almost want to just add on to it generally. Like at this moment where literally the California standards in terms of how farm labor history is taught is being revised, and historians and educators are having to rethink that curriculum. Like I'm just kind of curious if you can think about your mutual areas of expertise and how might that be taught for young people, like so I'll leave it at that, but really I want you to think, if you can, about like K through 12 curriculum. Like, how can your research fit in that framework to help us, learn a more complex farm labor history?
Would you like to start, Dr. Cruz?
Sure, I'll take a shot at it. I don't know, but that one I wasn't expecting K through 12. Let me think. I think one place we could start, perhaps, and I don't know what you mean by revision of the curriculum in California. I'm very curious about what exactly that entails. When I heard that, I got scared.
Would
Could you
you would
explain a
you
little
like
quick?
me to clarify? Would that be
Yeah,
helpful?
please. Yes.
So again, a lot of folks on the webinar, and just if you're reading the news, the New York Times had a 5-year investigation article come out on allegations of sexual harassment, right, against Cesar Chavez, including testimony from Dolores Huerta. And very quickly, legislatures and cities have rethought the Cesar Chavez Day and the holiday. But now the question is really moving to curriculum, right?
Right.
Filipinos have been instrumental, the historical society, in pushing AB 123 in California about implementing Filipino studies and Lariat Leong. So I guess my question is like, again, farm labor history, I've always argued, is very complex, right? But it needs to be something that we're learning about, not just in higher education, but for young people. So, and I think that was the point for Patricia's question, is like, why isn't this in K through 12 curriculum? Why isn't it so-called in the history books?
I absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to say, I understood that. Yes, of course. I laid in bed for 4 hours reading that New York Times article over and over again. I thought you were referring to something that was occurring before last week, some sort of revisionist movement that was occurring before. So I got confused. Sorry about that.
Hmm.
So how do we approach this problem? Is that the question? How can we?
Yeah. I mean, the question was, why do you think the history books don't really talk about this?
Oh, right. I'll take a shot at it. I mean, I don't know. I think one thing we learned last week, I think we already knew it. Let me just say something about the UFW. I think it's become, it was, even 20 years ago, I would have referred to it as a moribund oligarchic organization. I think that maybe just the canonization of a figure just blocked out these narratives. I'm not sure if that's part of what happened. It just didn't acknowledge them. I think we see groups of people ignored and marginalized all the time in all sorts of histories. And maybe that's part of what has happened to if you will, the Filipino narrative or the Filipino narratives. That's me taking a shot at an answer.
I have a few thoughts on that, which is, I could almost look at like every level of society and see how that history does not convey like the true diversity, right, of the history. So and then also how we don't tie local histories to their like global context. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. I mean, UC Davis, if you look at our history, and we're like have a tremendous influence globally, right, on agriculture and agricultural development. But if you look at the history of our institutions, you would think like it's so dominated by the history of white Californians. And it was only through like my research actually going to the archive did I find that the horticulturalist George Pierce, who successfully lobbied to have, the University of California's farm school, that's what UC Davis initially was before the 1950s, located here in Davis, that on his farm here in Davis, his right-hand man was named Muncha Singh. And he was a Punjabi Sikh man. And he actually was he was a secretary in the Ghadar party. And it's supposedly he had Ghadar like revolutionary meetings right here in Davis on George Pierce's farm. So like even all the way down to like our university, the true like global reach and diversity of who can make history, who is important enough to make history is still so hotly contested, right? And even among, we have over 1,000 students of Punjabi heritage at UC Davis. And it's in the presence of Punjabis in California, particularly in this area, is enormous. But even people in the community don't know about the history of Punjabis, and especially like their contribution to California's development, to history, to radicalism, to, so many different facets. So and one other further point I want to make is that I just went to the Association of Asian Studies conference in Vancouver. And what struck me was how little attention there is to labor history right now. I think there was like one panel on internationalism. Maybe there was more, but there was very little attention paid by scholars to labor history. And then even more than that, if we look at like diasporic, farm workers or interracial, transracial, multiracial history, there's just so much work yet to be done. And a final point I want to make, because the panelist who's going to speak about Yemeni farm workers wasn't here, and I just want to make a few key points about that important research. I love the work of Professor Niama Alamri, and her family was involved in the United Farm Workers movement. They were from Yemen. And I always tell people here, because there's so many Arabic speakers on our campus, that one of the first UFW signs was in Arabic, in California, because of the Yemeni farm workers. And again, it just seems like Dr. Alamri's work on the anti-colonial politics of the Yemeni farm workers was so important, how it tied to changes in identity of farm workers from the Middle East was really fascinating. But also it's a history that I think so many people, and especially I'm here at the university, I think students would really benefit from, and yet there aren't many people working on it, and there's very little awareness of this important history. So those are like, I think we just all have a lot to do in terms of teaching this history at all levels of education, because it's so important and it's relevant to our lives.
Yes, I
If I,
highly recommend
I'm
to
sorry.
everyone Dr. Lamry's article in Boom, California. I have my students read it, and it's
Yes.
it's especially meaningful for my Yemeni students. And I apologize, Adrian, I cut you off.
No, it's fine. It's fine. No, I just a couple of things. I'm actually now beginning to think in terms of like a sociology of academia. It's when we try to publish work, when we try to write different narratives, different analyses, the sociologist Norman Denzin used to say, when you're trying to publish something, you're trying to break into a political economy. It's a political economy, and certain parties and entities are blocked out and locked out of those economies. So what you're writing about is not just some objective analysis. There's something political embedded in it. So I think of that, and I also think about Patricia Hill Collins, another sociologist, in her book Black Feminist Thought, right, which talks about how Black women, Black scholars are trying to tell their story from this, what she calls a distinctive viewpoint. And that distinctive viewpoint does not comport. And often, if you will, to use the word resist, it resists, right? This sort of dominant, sort of white scholars, right? They don't want it necessarily. It's not necessarily wanted or desired within the academy. The last thing I will say from personal experience, I have had at least two really negative experiences in my career in which I was told by somebody that uh, in one of my jobs, I was told, you really don't need to have a Latinx sort of focused seminar, a seminar focused on Latinx people, because you just sort of incorporate them into your general classes. They can just be in a survey class. You don't need to have a separate sort of Latinx focus course. Luckily, the department chair at that time fought against that mindset. And so we had the class. That happens. And I've had other experiences as well that I don't think we have enough time to get into. So it's there, right? Those barriers are there. That's my point. It's a political act to write a lot of this research. That's what I wanted to say.
No, I appreciate you sharing that, Adrian. There was an interesting question, I believe, in the Q&A, so I do want to read it. So make sure we answer it. It says, this goes back to, I think, Nicole, your earlier presentation. That slogan was very striking. The one that said, quote, reward, death, field of battle, India, end quote. That was inspiring. They gave up security to go fight. It seems like we don't think and act that way today. What made them willing to do that?
There was this that's a great question. I mean, they had this incredible life philosophy. Those who were dedicated their lives to like that revolutionary movement, not only did they transcend all of these kind of barriers or differences that they had been socialized to follow since birth, of like your hierarchy, your socioeconomic hierarchy, different religions, classes and so forth. They said that all people were equal, and they wanted to, fight for the rights for, and social justice, in India, but also for workers worldwide, right? But the mentality was, this generation is going to sacrifice our life for future generations. I mean, if you imagine if your whole family invested on you to go to the other side of the planet, and then as soon as you went to the other side of the planet, they were just here. One of the biggest speeches was in Sacramento. And they said that after just the workers gave a speech, they would also sing songs. And after this one, worker spoke, they said it was like a fire that had been lit, and it went from body to body to body to body. And those who basically had no money, right? They signed up, a huge proportion of them signed up to return to India, with the likely event that they would be caught or they would be killed in order to liberate their country. So that's a very big question, which is really, and I think a lot of it has to do with like our consciousness and how you get this, like, I think more of a communal consciousness of workers that transcends divisions, but also is not going to benefit you personally, but is going to yield hopefully for a better society.
No, thank you for that response. I think that definitely answered the audience questions.
Mm.
So we've officially reached the moment in the webinar where we definitely want to let the audience know if you have a question, like now's the time to ask it. As a moderator, I do have the tendency to monopolize the conversation, so I just wanted to say that publicly. So again, if you have a question, now is the time to absolutely put it in the chat or the Q&A. And as you think about that, audience members, I do want to at least ping our panelists on a kind of concluding question, like that I think the audience would just love to hear. Like so, and I'll just say it, and then you can respond to it however you see fit. So, to Adrian, I mean, in your bio, and we talked about this before we went recording. About your new project about Mexican food in Tokyo is just I really want to hear more about that. And I think the audience does too. And then to Nicole, I mean, you're an expert in digital humanities, and I think your presentation tonight only scratched the surface a little bit about your DH work. And so I'm just curious if you can. I mean, you've shared some resources and whatnot, but maybe just kind of comment on your future DH work in this area. Like, what are some tools that we should be thinking about and digging deeper on? I know there were some links dropped to ArcGIS maps, but I'll throw that out there. And again, for the audience, if you have questions along the way, please now's the time to ask.
Sure, I'll talk about Tokyo tacos all day long. I think the first thing I would say is I think we should now begin to regard Mexicans as a diaspora. They are a diasporic group across the North American continent. They have spread and dispersed to almost every point in the United States. They are the fastest growing Latin American group in Canada. They're not a big population, but that's still significant. I think that I hypothesize that the dispersion of this group across this, kind of global economic political center of the planet, where Mexican food is, I think we can say, almost ubiquitous in the United States. I think so. It has translated into it has globalized. So, basically, my colleague and I are interviewing taco pop-up Mexican restaurant owners. Mexican food has boomed down in Tokyo for about a decade. I've been visiting Japan for 25 years, and now I live here and I see lots of tacos, and they're good. The quality is good. 25 years ago, not so much. And the last story that I'll tell is that in one of our research trips, which includes tacos and beer, a man walked in, ordered tacos, and he sat down. I kind of interviewed him, and I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark." And I said, "Oh," I said, "are tacos common in Copenhagen?" He's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, tacos have become quite big." So it's globalized, even though I don't think there's a significant Mexican population in Denmark. So it's a fascinating sort of diffusion, right, of this cuisine. And so we just want to talk to the owners, talk to the patrons. What do they perceive this food as? Why did they show up? Why do people go to these? How do they learn about Mexican food? What do they think it was? And we're at the beginning stages, but we've started it off quite nicely. Thank you for
Yeah,
the
thank
question.
thank you for sharing that response. And even Nicole, before you move to the DH question, I mean, I just got me thinking about like Punjabi Mexican fusion food. I'm starting to see
Yeah.
that pop up too. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but like some of the
Well,
best like Indian food I've ever had is in the Central Valley.
yeah, so I guess two points on food. One is that there used to be like Punjabi Mexican restaurants, that accompanied the Punjabi Mexican American community. There was one on, I think it was on Garden Highway in Yuba City. And a lot like the members of the communities like would talk about all the similarities between Mexican food and Punjabi food. Like there's a tortilla and the roti. There's like, some similarity in the vegetables, the spices, and so forth. And I'll just mention a lot of the spices that we think of as, integral to Indian food came from the New World. There are very few spices that, were indigenous to the Indian subcontinent. Like, so a lot of like the red chili, potatoes, so many different like produce came as a result of colonialism. And likewise, much of what we consider as quintessentially English, it actually came from India, right? So there's that connection. But an interesting thing in the West Coast of the United States with Punjabi food is that as Punjabis have gone into trucking, right, that you could almost look at Highway 5 as like a food corridor, like a Punjabi food corridor, right? And so you wouldn't have to go very long before, even in the middle of nowhere or not very, well-populated areas, there will be like a dhaba, which is a, Punjabi restaurant. And then there are also, you may or may not know that gurdwaras or Sikh temples are open. They have meals are open 24 hours a day, and anyone can go and eat there. And part of this like generosity of spirit, like in the Sikh community, is that they will go out and actually feed people who are unhoused, or they want to make sure that everyone has enough to eat. And so at like major Nagar Kirtans or events near in connection with special holidays, and there's a parade, they'll also go and feed people. And one of the most moving experiences I had was when I was accompanying the parade in Stockton, and they were going out, and this is not food that's easily transportable. This would be like a whole Punjabi meal. And then there were so many people who were lined up from the Stockton community where there was real hunger and poverty receiving the meals from the community. So that's something that is really remarkable and extraordinary about the Punjabi community, is how generous they are in feeding people. But back to digital humanities, which is just that, I worked in partnership with the Punjabi community and developing a digital archive. And I just want to second what both of you have said and done in your careers, which is to say that oral history is incredibly important. And I also feel that as a professor in a land-grant institution, I feel that it's essential not just to write books for the academy, but also to share knowledge in engaging ways with the general public. And so that's why I was involved in creating a documentary and the digital archive, so that we can make this history sort of come to life, for not only to benefit the communities in which we work in and serve, but also for like the broader public. So I think it's so important as historians that we're involved in preserving history and the community's history, and that's a really important way of broadening out who gets to make history, but also that we are involved in knowledge sharing and also educating, the broader public. And as a final thing, we'll just say thank you to the California Public Library, because I've used many resources. You have an incredible archives, and you play an important role right now in our society at a time where we like badly need this kind of public engagement.
No, that's a beautiful segue to sort of end our conversation before we turn it back over to the library folks. And again, thank you so much, Nicole, Adrian, for your presentations, your work, this conversation, and again to the audience for hanging out with us and talking these important topics in rural California, and helping us rethink these important themes about agriculture, labor, migration, and labor, and what it means for our state. So thank you again so much for joining us.